America is a brand. If you are an American, you are an affiliate or a brand ambassador. So I think that the question as consumers and ambassador really is, what is the value proposition? Does America deliver on its brand promise of freedom and justice for all, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What is the cost of our buy-in?
Welcome to Marketing Muckraking, the show that asks not simply what brand culture can do for us, but what it's doing to us. With your host, creative director, and brand strategist gone wild, Rachel K. Albers, making fun of business and making business fun. This is the show for rebels, revolutionaries, and renegades who run businesses that burn the rulebook. If you're sick of business podcasts that have all the answers, well, I got nothing but questions. Let's go.
Episode 18, America is a brand. Does it deliver on its brand promise? This is what I'm choosing to do instead of celebrating the 4th of July. I want to talk a little bit about the brand of America. And in the spirit of Marketing Muckraking, diving into history, here's a fun or not so fun, depending on how you look at it, fact. Did you know that the Pledge of Allegiance was originally written by a Christian socialist copywriter in 1892 for the Youth Companion newspaper, and the Pledge of Allegiance was designed to sell more newspapers. And I'll get into that a little bit more later, but the Pledge of Allegiance, which even today is still recited by school children all over the country, originated as advertising. And actually, the term under God wasn't added until I believe it was 1954. Then it was added to make sure that we were separating ourselves from the godless communists. But the Pledge of Allegiance originated as advertising copy to sell newspapers. How about them apples? So today we're talking about America as a brand. And I think that we can really see clearly how America has been marketed to us throughout its history, both by the government and also amidst ourselves and through commerce. And as we get a little further into the history of patriotic marketing and advertising, you'll kind of see these things are inextricable. It's really hard to separate the marketing of America and the leveraging of America as a tool to market. They go hand in hand. We're going to look at the brand of America kind of through a few lenses before we take our deep dive into history. So we can see that America is a brand very clearly, one, through copywriting. There is no brand, I'm just going to make a definitive statement. There is no brand throughout history that has used more consistent language around its promise. So the language that we hear and that is associated with America, the brand, freedom, liberty, happiness, justice, and I could go on and on. So America has some pretty savvy copywriters. And within this copywriting, the copywriting appeals very specifically to our pain points. In the messaging around America, the brand, it appeals very much to our sense of scarcity, to our sense of fear, of what would happen to us if we didn't live here, right? Like what would happen to the world if America didn't exist, right? So within the copywriting around the American brand, one of the big messaging points that has gone back all the way to the beginning is appealing to our pain points and our fears and our scarcity. The third way that America is a brand, opt-ins, the good old lead magnet. Not only was the Pledge of Allegiance, as I told you, advertising copy written to sell newspapers, the Youth Companion, 1892. That's where it originated. Look it up. I wish I was making it up. And to incentivize readers to sell more newspapers, well, you got a free American flag. How about them apples? It's a lead magnet. It's an affiliate marketing scheme. But even if you think about the context of the country as a whole, when we vote, we are opting in to a sense of political efficacy that keeps us invested in the brand, right? And, when we vote, it's free. And then in return, we're promised something. If you go out, if you opt in and you vote, you will receive political support for your vision of America in exchange, right? And we all watch election night like we watch the Super Bowl. So the question then becomes, when we opt in through voting, do politicians deliver on their brand promise? These are the questions to ask ourselves. Thinking about brand messaging around America, when branding first became a thing, lots of brands tried to make sure that people didn't go to their general store to buy the generic product. They wanted you to buy Sapolio or Pond's or whatever it might be, Coca-Cola. So they would create ads that said, accept no substitutes. Nothing can substitute for the quality, the price, all of the genuineness of our product. Accept no substitutes. You've probably even seen this in modern advertising. It still works its way in. And so in the messaging around the brand of America, we are told to accept no substitutes. As school children, we are taught here in the USA that this is the greatest country on earth and that everyone else falls short. And when you critique America or the capitalist principles that it's based on, let's go back to that pain point marketing. The response is always, well, America might not be great, but let's talk about how bad it is everywhere else. And let's talk about what the alternative could be. So accept no substitutes. There's no substitute for America. And finally, all of this is in service to promoting our American brand loyalty. In branding in general, brands were created essentially to help. One of their features, one of their functions is to help justify a higher price. Why would you spend more on this branded soap when you can get a generic version for X amount less, right? Well, brands are creating campaigns and messaging and ads and all of the things so that we will associate their product with higher quality, right? So we're willing to pay more to be brand loyal, and we have emotional connections, a sense of identity, a sense of being part of something when we continue to patronize the same brand. So America, in that same way, promotes our brand loyalty to the country. And the question then for us becomes, what higher price are we paying to be brand loyal to America as an institution above all else? Is it worth the cost? Before we kind of get into analyzing how we got here, how did we go from 1776 to 4th of July mattress sales? How did we go from the Revolutionary War to today when, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those ads from Johnsonville Brats, but one of their ad slogans is, you can't spell sausage without USA. Okay, how did we get from the founding fathers to phallic sausage ads to stop for 4th of July? Let's go on a journey. And so before we get there, I want to kind of return and revisit the concept of branding in and of itself. What is a brand? Well, I would contend that a brand is essentially a memory, right? It is how we remember, how we associate, how the expectations that we build, typically through multiple contacts with a brand, that then creates all of these memories in our brains that we carry along with us. The brand isn't what the company says it is, right? A brand lives in the eye of the beholder. That's why branding is so complicated, because when you're rebranding, for example, when you're rebranding a business, what essentially you're doing is you're making a wish. You're saying, I hope that if I do all of these things, I can align my brand with these adjectives, with these emotional associations. And I'm going to create campaigns and content and ads and all of that stuff and brand experiences in order to make my wish come true, right? Branding, the act of branding, of trying to align messaging around a set of associations, a set of words, a feeling, is an act of making a wish and then doing a bunch of things to make your wish come true. So you could also say a brand is a reputation, right? But then it kind of goes back to the idea that a brand is a memory. What is a reputation but a set of memories, right? And a set of experiences. And as branding kind of got its start, the early branders of the late 19th century, early 20th century, they sold it to companies based on the concept of, we are going to engineer your reputation. I think it was Theodore McManus who came up with the word dependability for Dodge Motors. He made up that word. Like, that word exists in our lexicon because Theodore McManus, who was an early advertising copywriter, created the word for Dodge. And what he told Dodge was, in the past, a company would have to spend years engineering and developing its reputation. But now, because of advertising, what we can do is we can manufacture, we can engineer your reputation in as little as a few weeks, months, days even. And he came up with the word dependability, which also kind of dovetails into the American brand messaging. So when you are in the act of branding something, you're imbuing that product with meaning, with emotional associations. This is what justifies paying a higher price for a brand product than you would a generic product. Why are we willing to pay more for Nike shoes than we are a generic sports shoe that we could get somewhere like Target? Because of our emotional connection to the brand, because of what the brand represents about us and our identity, what it says about us, because of our desire to be part of the community. And Nike has very overtly and specifically inserted itself into cultural movements, into various communities, so that owning and wearing a Nike shoe says something about you, and it says something about the community that you're a part of. So as I was thinking about this in application to America, the brand, I was thinking, wow, we are really willing to pay. I mean, it feels as though increasingly higher prices for being in America, for buying into America. And we do this because of our emotional connection. What other brand out there could afford to make all the promises that America makes and has made historically throughout its history and not deliver on those promises and still have people buying it? If Nike shoe says, we're going to make you run faster, we're going to help you do this or that, and then the shoes fall apart on your feet after one or two runs, would people keep buying Nike shoes? They would have to spend a lot of money in advertising campaigns to get people to stay bought in. And they would probably have to innovate and change their product. And I kind of think of our buy-in to the American brand a little bit like America is asking us to put our freedom on layaway. Like, we're going to ask you to keep buying in, and we're going to keep the freedom here in our warehouse, here in our back room for later. And we promise we'll deliver on it, but we are going to need to make a few more payments into the American brand before you get the freedom, before you get the liberty, before you get the pursuit of happiness. So the American brand is really asking us to make consistent payments, and we're putting our freedom on layaway, and who knows when we're going to get it. What other brand would we as consumers tolerate that with? We wouldn't. But somehow the American brand industrial complex has done a really good job of making us believe that we should continue paying in, putting our freedom on layaway, and it's coming soon, right? There's like a supply chain issue with freedom right now. And it's like, you got to do your part. You got to wait. That comes back in World War II as we kind of go through this historical journey. At the end of the day, what branding hopes to do, right? I was saying, when you're branding a business, when you're branding a company, when you're branding an idea, what you're doing as the brander is you're making a wish. I hope that you, the consumer, you, the audience, will associate me with these various things: quality, dependability, all of the things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create campaigns. I'm going to do all of these different things to move you closer to remembering me that way. Ultimately, the goal of all of this is if you do this long enough and you have enough good indicators, right? Like a logo or a color palette or a jingle, these kind of brand emblems, these brand symbols will act kind of like a shortcut. Look, remember how I said that branding is a memory? A brand is a memory. It lives in the eye of the beholder. So the American flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, all of these things are meant to function like shortcuts so that when we see them, we immediately think freedom, justice, liberty. These indicators are ultimately meant to bypass our reasoning and logic. Sometimes you hear Donald Miller, who I have a complicated relationship with, talking about how you don't want your audience to expend too many calories, too much brain power to understand what it is you're selling, to quickly be able to identify you, to understand what it is that you're giving them, so that I don't have to work too hard to figure out, number one, who you are and what you're supposed to represent and embody and what you're selling to me. You couldn't find a more perfect example of that than the American flag. Is there an ethical way of doing branding and marketing, or is it just always unethical? One of the viewers asked. And, I think that I'm going to answer that question with a question and say, how do you define ethical? I get a lot of questions. When are you going to come out with an ethical marketing course, RKA? I don't know. Maybe I will. It's not, definitely not anywhere near the top of my list at this point. But the reason that I have a hard time doing that is because ethics and ethical branding and marketing cannot be easily scaled, not in my purview, because it implies that we all share a common vision of what is ethical, right? I do believe that capitalism as a economic system and the way that it actually functions in our world, combined with globalization and neoliberalism and all of the ways that our world economy has evolved, I believe capitalism as an economic system is inherently unethical. So I think participating in it, which we are forced to do, and that's the hard part, right? This isn't about like, oh, I'm going to go run away and escape capitalism, because even if you're not in a capitalist country, the way that you exist within that country, the imports, the exports, and just the geopolitical environment and climate is influenced and affected by capitalism. So it's not as easy as saying I'm out, but I think that the economic system itself, at this point in the reality of how it's practiced and our current global climate, is inherently unethical, right? Because it doesn't allow for all people in the world to live well. Someone's getting screwed. Lots of someones are getting screwed. So therefore I have a problem with the system. I think we can do better. Let's think bigger. That's kind of my non-answer answer. Branding professionals are tasked with essentially trying to create a message that people remember. And so we've got things like the American flag and the Star Spangled Banner, which immediately are meant to hopscotch over our reasoning, over our critical thinking, and just evoke this emotional response from us. And in this way, American branding has been very effective. One of the things that I observe this year, it's like the first year that I've really seen the majority of my community or the people in my life getting on the bandwagon of not being excited about the 4th of July. I'm not saying this is the first time people in general haven't been excited about the 4th of July, because ambivalence over the 4th of July goes all the way back to the beginning of the country, okay? But now it's become more mainstream. This year, they're like, I'm not celebrating the 4th of July because I don't think we have any freedom. And it's like, okay, but did we last year? Did we 50 years ago? Did we 100 years ago? Did we 200? I mean, let's think about it though. Let's really think about it. I sometimes get bristled by people who, as they have a stake in something and they suddenly start to wake up, they'll be like, this isn't what this country is about. And it's like, isn't it? Let's go back to the beginning, my friends. Let's talk about layaway. Let's talk about the Brand America layaway plan. The Constitution in and of itself was saying to people, here's what this country believes. We're not actually going to deliver on it yet. Took some amendments to get there, and even they didn't get there, right? Like, we were still desegregating schools in the 2000s, people. And with gerrymandering and districting, you could argue that we still have segregated schools. So what I'm saying about this is, even the Constitution, even the Declaration of Independence, you could interpret them to be little more than copywriting. And little more than let's get the customer, let's get the audience to buy into the message, even though it's kind of a little bit of that fake it till you make it Elizabeth Holmes. We're going to get billions of dollars of investments for a product that doesn't exist yet. Because freedom and justice for all sounds really nice. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness sounds amazing. But at the advent of this country, the founding fathers didn't deliver on that. Not to all of its people. You had to be a white, rich, landowning male, Christian, Protestant, not Catholic, all of those things. That's who the brand promise of the Constitution and the original message of the United States of America was promised to. And even then, it wasn't across the board, right? And yet, going back to this concept of, okay, now it's becoming a little bit more popular to be like, wait a minute, I'm not celebrating the 4th of July because we don't have any freedoms this year. And this is the brand, right? This is the brand. The idea that we've lost something that we once had is brand messaging and not truth. Yes, okay, so it's true that with the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade and the many decisions that came down in the last few weeks, there were losses of rights that previously, for a period of time, some people had, right? And that's a very complicated thing. And at the very same time, there was a pre-Roe v. Wade, right? There was a time before Roe v. Wade decision came down. And amidst Roe v. Wade happening in the Supreme Court, there were a lot of other liberties that people didn't have at that time. So I think that it's really an example of the effectiveness of the American brand message that people this year would say, oh, now we've lost the spirit of America. Instead of maybe we never fully got there. Maybe we never fully achieved the mission and aims of the Constitution. It was copywriting and the product is still on layaway. All right. We're still making payments and hoping that we get the product one of these days, right? What I also see, and this is also the effectiveness of the brand messaging around the United States of America, is when people do critique the country, it is typically couched in this concept of, I am being patriotic by critiquing America. I am expressing my freedoms because, yes, throughout history, the idea of being patriotic was linked to your morality, that to be a good person, this is why not only is America a brand, it's also a religion, that being a good person meant saying, I love this country, right? And I have questions around that. I have questions around whether loving America makes you a better human being. Why is that so? I remember when I was in second grade in my school, we did this assembly and we got up and sang, I'm proud to be an American. And so we sang this song and we had learned it for weeks before the assembly. And my parents were there and my mom was there and she was sobbing. She was weeping. And she told this story for years. And she would tell family and friends, she'd be like, Rachel was up there and she was singing her little heart out. She's such a patriot. She loves this country. And I was like, I hate to bring it to you, Mom, but I just really love to sing. I love to sing. I'll sing any ditty. Give me a song. I'm here for the party. And that was my mom's kind of brand loyalty showing through. But we tend to be afraid to disagree or critique this nation if it's not couched in some sort of a rhetoric around loving the country while we do it. That's what I'm doing to show my love for this country, right? And so that's brand loyalty right there. Even on both sides, you got people who are very stridently, proudly excited and continuing to celebrate America and believe that it has delivered on its brand promise, right? Those people typically are the ones that have power and privilege and wealth, right? And so for them, they're like, yeah, I got freedom to fuck other people over. What are you doing about it? And then on the other side, though, you also see the folks that are critiquing the country that have asked these questions. Does America deliver on its brand promise? They ask the questions, they start to realize no, or they start to think, I've put a lot of payments into layaway and I'm still not getting the freedoms, the justice, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that I was promised. And now I'm getting pissed. And yet still we are trained to couch our critique and our frustration within the context of, but I love this country. Why do you have to love this country? I don't understand. I don't know. It's just a question. I don't know if I even have the answer for myself about that, but at the end of the day, we are still acting like brand ambassadors for what the country is told to us through its messaging that it's meant to symbolize. We believe so much in this brand promise. And as I said a few minutes ago, I wanted you to ask yourself, is there any other brand that could make promises for 200 plus years that it doesn't deliver on, that we would stay bought into, even if it didn't deliver on its brand promise, even if it had a history of contradicting its own brand promise? We have more brand loyalty to this brand than any other brand. And so, all right, how did we get here? How did we get from the Revolutionary War to the 4th of July being used to sell mattresses and beer? And so if you love Marketing Muckraking, you know I am here for the historical deep dive. And part of that is because, especially in the age of the internet, we tend to see things as if they're all brand new. And that word new is going to come up here in kind of our historical deep dive. If we want to find a new way, if we want to find a better path, we need to know where we've come from so we don't retrace our steps and call them new and improved. We're going to go from early American advertising all the way back into when the colonies themselves were being advertised to people in Eastern, Western Europe to come over to the US into the 1800s. And, as the Industrial Revolution happened, the turn of the century into the 20th century, that's when shit got wild. This is when it very clearly became a connection between being American and enjoying its freedoms meant the freedom to buy and the freedom to choose between different products and the freedom to purchase. And that really got ramped up and reinforced and in World War I and World War II. And then after World War II, we've seen a diversification of the message. As we talk about Roe v. Wade and we talk about the different civil liberties that were won from social justice movements and liberation movements, the brand of America itself and the brands that supported and enriched America itself had to respond to that. They could no longer sell the image of the person that was afforded life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness from the very beginning of this country, which was the rich, white, landowning Protestant males. Then they had to give us a little bit of, wait, well, we know there's other people in this country, so let's make sure that they're represented in the advertising and that they're part of the American dream too. And then all the way to today when, as I said, we got Johnsonville brats saying you can't spell sausage without USA. Wow, we've come a long way, people. So let's start with early American advertising. In the book, Accept No Substitutes, which is really about the early American advertising and how buying was sold to us, buying was sold to Americans as an act of patriotism. But before we even got there, in this book, the author says historians have called the effort to people the American colonies the world's first large-scale advertising campaign. So we know that part of the effort to people the American colonies was through slavery. So that's one piece of the pie. And the other part of how do we fill this country with people who are going to pay taxes and who are going to build out the infrastructure was advertising campaigns. So America was sold as a brand before America as a country formally existed. And you had kind of like smooth talking salesmen across Western Europe going into the crowded poor slums, giving them pamphlets, handbills, posters. And honestly, they were like the early, life coaches of the time being like, all of your problems will be solved in the United States of America. Equating America with this new world, a world of friendship, harmony, fame, or success, advertising America to people to bring them here so that they would, populate the country, pay their taxes, and help build the damn infrastructure. Because the little teeny weeny white guys who came over here to colonize this place, they couldn't build it. That is why the folks who originally colonized this country had to resort to things like slavery, as well as bringing people literally from across the world to build the infrastructure of the United States for free, and indentured servitude. And then also, as I said, going to the poor slums of Western Europe to sell the vision of America, the brand, as a home of phrases were used like new world, new heaven on earth, new nation. That was kind of the currency of the time. A new freedom, new social institutions, new paths, new harvest, newness and change were a big part of the American brand message throughout history of advertising. When you talk about us buying into the American message, the American brand, and essentially putting our freedoms on layaway, right? We're paying in, but we're not getting the product back. Some of the earliest advertising in the late 1700s to the 1800s really was offerings of rewards for runaway enslaved people. And real estate notices. So those were some of the biggest ads that even existed in early America itself. So how about that for America contradicting its own brand message? Freedom and justice for all, and at the very same time, most of our advertising is to help you capture your runaway slaves. At the very same time, advertising was really taking shape at this time. It was like in its very early phases. E.L. Lomax of the Union Pacific Railway System said, by always appearing the same to the public, by the use of a trademark and by catchy phrases, freedom, new world, new hope, friendship, success, all these things, making the familiar dress larger or smaller as the case might be, but always the same dress until the public came to look upon advertisements as they would upon an old friend. So this really is the goal and the function of branding. As I told you, it's meant to ultimately, you're making a wish, you're making a hope. I hope that I can align your memory and your vision of my product or my country with these ideals. And I'm going to repeat them and repeat them and repeat them and repeat them until not only do you remember us this way, do you associate us or our product or our country with these messages and believe in them almost as a shorthand, but so that you see them with familiarity and with comfort, like an old friend. New was such a huge keyword here. And in the 1700s and the 1800s, consumption of American products was also sold to people as a way that they could themselves achieve the brand promise of America that ultimately was only promised and delivered to a very small few of the population. So it was the idea that you, as a member of any marginalized group, could buy your way to a better life. And that became more and more popular, especially at the turn of the 20th century. One of the things that I found really interesting about kind of early advertising in America was a lot of goods that existed in the early days of the country were portraits of founding fathers, portraits of famous like war heroes and things like that. And so people wanted to buy their little piece of American history, which this was essentially like reinforcing the brand message at the same time, like turning the leaders into heroes and all of that stuff. But what was really interesting is what some vendors would do is they were kind of rewriting history as it was happening, in the sense that they would sometimes sell portraits of the war and of battles that were won that weren't really won. This happened a lot with Thomas Jefferson. Like, as different things were happening, they would create these portraits to embody a historical moment in the war that was actually completely inaccurate. So talk about rewriting and whitewashing history as it is literally happening. Let's fast forward a little bit to the turn of the century. And when I say the turn of the century, I'm talking about the 1800s to the 1900s. And let's return to what I told you, the Pledge of Allegiance. So the Pledge of Allegiance originated as advertising copy to sell newspapers. And the newspaper that it was created for was the Youth Companion in 1892 by Francis Bellamy. The Pledge of Allegiance was created as part of a publicity campaign for the Youth's Companion. And what they did was they're like, okay, how can we get more schools to buy our newspapers so that the newspapers are in our schools? And how can we reach our target market, which is school children? We're going to create a day to commemorate Columbus Day, right? We're going to commemorate Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492 or some shit. And what we're going to do is we're going to create essentially an event that all of these school kids can do in their various schools. And they wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. Francis Bellamy, who was a former like Baptist preacher and a socialist, and then he turned into a copywriter. He wrote this, and they incentivized their readers to sell more newspapers by saying, we'll give you a free flag. And they gave free flags to the schools that participated in this national public school celebration. Let's go look at what the original Pledge of Allegiance was. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So under God was not added until 1954, and it was meant to make sure that we were separating ourselves from the godless communists. So under God didn't even make it into the Pledge of Allegiance until 1954, but it was originated in 1892, as I said, as a way to sell newspapers, right? This wasn't a government institution. The country didn't get together and say, we want our kids to say something about the country at the very beginning of their school day. No, not at all. And essentially they set up like a little affiliate model. Like, if you sell more newspapers, join our American MLM. If you sell more subscriptions, we'll give you a flag. If you look at the Pledge of Allegiance's origins, what you're really saying when you say the pledge is, I pledge allegiance to capitalism, right? I pledge to help you sell more newspapers. And so, yeah, by World War I, most schools in the country were reciting the Pledge of Allegiance at the very beginning of the school day. Patriotic campaigns at the time were also meant to kind of get our buy-in to nationalism and to see our efficacy, our political efficacy as citizens through consumption. This is when essentially what was created was The citizen consumer. The idea that you can express your citizenship, you can express your political efficacy through what you buy. And if you look throughout the history of the country, there were various times where Buy American campaigns increased in popularity, typically around wartime. And the idea of shopping for the nation and that saving money was considered a form of selfishness. Like, you are selfless, you are contributing to the greater good by buying more. And so at the turn of the 20th century, really we're coming off of the Industrial Revolution. European and American societies started to think of themselves as consumer societies. And this was new because before the Industrial Revolution and even going into the early 1900s, the majority of the country was agrarian. They were rural. And people didn't have disposable income to buy a lot of stuff. They made their own stuff. They made their own food. They made their own clothes. And if you bought something, you bought it from someone you knew, someone who you knew their reputation, right? Their brand reputation. And you did it very rarely. And then with the Industrial Revolution, suddenly we have all these factories. We all have all these mass-produced goods. How are we going to make sure that the country keeps growing, that it stays cutting edge? How are we going to make sure that these capitalists who run the factories get their investment back? We've got to train people to buy and to buy as a regular habit. This was brand new for Americans. This is really the time where American consumption started becoming kind of inextricably tied to patriotism. The idea that you were buying as an expression of your freedom. Edward Filene, who ran the Filene's department store mammoth retail chain, Edward Filene, was in evangelizing to other capitalists, said, we have to school people, we have to train people in the school of freedom. And freedom was couched in terms around your freedom to buy whatever you want. It didn't matter the color of your skin or your gender or your status in society, your degree of power. Theoretically, in America, if you had the money, you could buy whatever you wanted. There was a very concerted effort to train Americans on the morality of consumption, that saving your money was selfish. You weren't contributing to the good of the nation if you were saving your money. And at the same time, this is when advertising was very unregulated. Most industries were unregulated. You remember Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which talked about the horrors of the meatpacking industry and how it took advantage of immigrants and laborers and the sweatshop conditions, as well as the putrid, rancid meat that they would sell to consumers. Upton Sinclair wrote this book, and that book is what caused there to be regulations around meat, the meat industry. And it also pushed towards eventual legislation around workplace conditions. So at this time, there's no regulation around advertising. There's very little regulation around industry. Advertising had kind of a bad rap. Most of the people who advertised had these bold, wild claims. And the advertising industry decided to come together in 1907 and create a truth in advertising, industry. If you are an advertiser, you're going to agree that you're not going to lie to your audience. But here's what changed the tide. And this changed American society. It changed global society forever. And it changed commerce forever. Was World War I served essentially to legitimize advertising as an industry, and it did it in a few ways. World War I is when advertising finally earned its stripes and got seen as a legitimate industry. England's campaign to recruit as many soldiers into the war effort as they could, and they have Lord Kitchener looking right at the viewer and saying, your country needs you. And before this effort, and this originated in England, before this effort, a government had never systematically created advertising messaging to appeal to its people or to deliver a message until World War I. And in the case of England, for example, they didn't have a conscription policy. They didn't have you have to mandatorily become a soldier. So they had to get millions of men to volunteer for war, despite the fact that there was a 50-50 chance that you would either die or get majorly seriously injured in war. So they created these campaigns to appeal to the hearts of their citizens, to say, your country needs you, to appeal to their emotions. And what happened? The great folks in America saw what was going on, and what do? Well, any good American does. We copied somebody else from another country, appropriated it, and supersized it, and that's where Uncle Sam came from. So what happened was George Creel started the Committee on Public Information under Woodrow Wilson. He essentially convinced Woodrow Wilson that the USA needed to have a concerted campaign, essentially an ongoing advertising campaign, to make sure that public opinion was in support of the war. Why? Because, okay, we've got millions of men going overseas, dying, right? And now there's rationing, there's decreased supply of products. If the country is angry, if the people are angry, they're not going to want soldiers to go to war. They're not going to want to pay their taxes. They're not going to support the war effort, right? So we need to have a concerted, systematic government campaign to appeal and to shape public opinion. This was the goal of it, was to shape public opinion. And they essentially did it in every way you possibly could. The CPI, the Committee on Public Information, they had movies, they had posters, they had newspaper ads, they had everything you can imagine, right? And what's really interesting about this was companies, businesses were encouraged to essentially buy advertising space in newspapers and donate it to the Committee for Public Information. So not only was this, yes, there was some government funding, but it really was the people who funded the propaganda that they then consumed and shaped their own opinions. It was like, we bought propaganda. We paid to be propagandized, right? So these businesses would buy ads in newspapers and then donate it to the war effort. Every single facet of public life had ads from the Committee for Public Information, and either they were ads straight up for the war effort or they were ads in tandem with companies. So a company would work with, there was something called the National Advertising Advisory Board, partnered with companies to make sure that the companies, when they created war-related ads, we're on brand for America. We're delivering the right message. And so here's an interesting one. Food is ammunition. Don't waste it. So the food supply was short at the time. People had to ration. And part of the reasons that people were rationing here in the USA was to make sure that allied countries and the soldiers had enough. So this message, which you saw started in World War I, but then came all the way through to World War II, was very hot in World War II, position these individual acts that you would do as your way of expressing your patriotism. Food is ammunition. So you've got to make sure you're rationing, you're not wasting food as your contribution to the war effort. How about this one? Little Americans, do your bit. Eat cornmeal mush. I mean, God, you really must love your country if you're going to eat mush for it. Oatmeal cornflakes. Eat no wheat cereals, because wheat was one of the things that were rationed. So it was all about corn at that time. Also at the time, sugar was really light. And so not only were you encouraged to ration your sugar intake, or you simply couldn't get access to it, but this is when corn syrup became a big deal. And if you've ever eaten peanut brittle was very highly popularized during World War I specifically as an alternative to other candies that use sugar. Do your part, eat peanut brittle. And now I know why I'm not a fan of peanut brittle. I never liked it. And it's because it was meant to be a sad swap for the candy that nobody could eat because they love their country too much. As you can see in these ads, everyone is being targeted with these ads. It's children, it's women. How about this one? Wake up, America, civilization calls. A lot of the ads were targeting women because not only were women making the majority of household purchases, but they were the ones home. But what they were able to observe is with the creation of the Committee of Public Information, where pro-war messaging wallpapered the country. Some of the companies themselves got in on the action. So you would either see straight up the businesses would buy ad space in newspapers and donate them to the Committee for Public Information, or they would work with the National Advertising Advisory Board to make sure that the companies were promoting pro-war messages in their commercial ads that aligned with what the Committee of Public Information wanted people to think about the war. Or companies that didn't want to be left out in the cold because it was the very in thing. You were seen as out of touch if you didn't somehow weave a war message into your advertising. So companies just went rogue. They just did their own thing. But most advertising was reinforcing and reaffirming this pro-war message. And here's what happened. As I said, before World War I, there was advertising had a dicey reputation. People considered advertising synonymous with dishonesty and getting scammed because there wasn't any regulation. You could say this patent medicine will cure every ailment from cancer to kidney troubles to female menstrual problems, right? And so people started getting wise to that, and they were very ambivalent and cynical about advertising. So not everyone was advertising is the point. But then the Committee of Public Information was created. It was the first American systematic advertising effort on the part of a nation to its consumers. And here's what happened. It worked. They were able to shape public perception. They were able to shift public opinion. It worked. And coming off of that time, now suddenly advertisers and businesses were like, oh my goodness gracious, great balls of fire. If we hit people enough with the same message, if we surround them with a message, we can change how they feel about things. And this is really when the conversation around whether we should be using propaganda or not kind of came into the public conversation. And there were kind of two schools of thought. You had Edward Bernays, who literally wrote the book Propaganda. And he went throughout his career doing things like popularizing smoking amongst women and overthrowing the Guatemalan government at one point on behalf of United Fruit / what you might know as Chiquita, but then, doing all these things in between. And in Bernays's point of view, propaganda was a good thing because you can't trust the public to their own devices. You can't trust that the public is going to make the right decisions, that they're going to vote for the right people. They're dumb. So we need to essentially tell them what to think. And then you had Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice at the time, who he was saying, if we truly want to take American freedom off of the layaway plan and be able to deliver it to people finally, the key to happiness, the key to freedom was the ability to think for yourself and was the nurturing of public discourse. Not a discourse centered around propaganda as ideals that we've been sold and repeated again and again and again until we think we came up with it, but really it was a message that we bought. But he believed in free discourse as the key to happiness and the key to true freedom and liberation. And so those were those kind of two schools of thought. One school of thought was we need to propagandize people because they're dumb. On the other side, it was like, no, if we really want to be a country that is based on freedom and happiness and the pursuit of happiness, people cannot achieve happiness and meaning if they are not free thinkers and if they can't chew on these difficult concepts themselves. And I think as we look at where we've arrived at today in 2022, you tell me who won that debate between propaganda and free discourse, okay? So then we move into World War II, and now it's like it's gangbusters. We're off to the races. World War I proved the effectiveness of propaganda and advertising. World War II, we had some fun with it, okay? So you can see in this ad, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. This is essentially a campaign that was meant to encourage people to do ride sharing to save on fuel. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, okay? We see that advertising has become a little bit more sophisticated in how they mess with our heads, right? I'm proud. My husband wants me to do my part. So here what we'll see is, yes, in World War I, before Rosie the Riveter ever existed and she came on the scene to essentially normalize and shift public opinion towards supporting women working because they literally had to, because everybody else was at war. Rosie the Riveter's mother and grandmother paved the way for her because women were heavily involved in the World War I war effort. But this time around with World War II, the powers that be realized that they were going to have to do a little bit more work to normalize public opinion, to normalize women working. So you can see here, I'm proud. My husband wants me to do my part. Isn't that interesting? It's literally like saying my husband told me I'm allowed to work. Okay, so you can't come for me because my headship, my head of household is down with it. If World War I legitimized advertising, World War II, they took it and ran with it. And what you saw was there were kind of a few different ways that the American brand was expressed through advertising and reinforced through advertising. One was, as I said, the Committee for Public Information. They just had a united message, a pro-war message that was everywhere. And they had pure and simple propaganda message that is meant to be pro-war. But then you also had companies getting into the game. And what was interesting about World War II specifically was there was a shortage of a lot of goods, and a lot of industries were focusing and concentrating their goods on the war effort. So that meant that people, that your average American citizen, couldn't buy as much. So what a lot of companies did was they would create these placeholder ads where they advertised for things that you could buy in the future. So they were trying to make sure that you kept their brand top of mind for after the war. If you couldn't buy it now, you could buy it later. So they essentially created these emotional, sentimental, patriotic ads. So you would associate their product with American patriotism, but also reinforcing this pro-war message. So here's an emotional ad, and the headline reads, "Never beyond the shore." And it's a picture of a woman looking off. She's sitting on the seashore with her little small child, looking off into the distance wistfully with seagulls above her head and her little child playing with his toy pail in the sand. And here's the copy. I can't even with this. "Here at the sea's edge is as near to Jim as I can go. Other women have gone farther than this. There were women on Corregidor. Women have gone to Ireland and Australia and Iceland. Women have been lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. But I know I would be foolish to dream of serving as they have. For a woman to go farther than this shore demands a special skill, complete independence, and I have neither." Oh shit, you have neither? Well, I thought you were American. "No, my task is here in the little storm-tight house that sits back from the cove, here with my son. And if I become discontent with the seeming smallness of my task, Jim's words come back to steady me. I'm leaving you a very important job, Mary. Until the war is won, there won't be any more evenings when we can sit by the fireside and plan our tomorrows together. It will be up to you to make the plans for the three of us. Mary," he said, "keep our dreams alive. Make no little plans, you who build the dream castles here at home. When you try to imagine the future after he returns, be sure your imaginings are full of bright and cheerful hues, for what the world of tomorrow will contain some of the best things of which you two have dreamed. Things that will be made possible by new materials like plastics, by new sciences like electronics, and most of all by the most magic power of electricity. Electricity. When you are dreaming of your better tomorrow, count on us. General Electric Company, Schenectady, New York. 192,000 employees of General Electric are on their jobs producing war goods and are buying more than $1 million in war bonds each week to hasten victory. Here, the General Electric radio program. Oh, I love this. Their content. They got some content. The GE All-Girl Orchestra. We're not women, we're girls. Sunday, 10 p.m. on NBC, The World Today. And then remember, we've got this woman looking forlorn as she dreams up. She's dreaming for the three of them, right? I found this at the vintage store and I loved it. And as I said, as I paged through, pretty much all of the ads have some sort of a war message. Things like there's an ad in here from Disney where you've got like a cartoon Mickey being like, "Buy war bonds." The focus of this messaging was you can't buy any GE products right now. We're working for the war, okay, ladies? But the best thing you can do is not buy anything and just sit on the seashore with your child and dream of tomorrow, and we will be there for you eventually, we hope. It was a really interesting time in advertising because what the companies ultimately were advertising was America. They were advertising the American dream. They were advertising the brand of freedom and justice, and you could participate. You could show your brand loyalty for America by one, this is where Rosie the Riveter came from, if you have any independence, because this woman sure didn't, because she has a husband and a son. So she, in her own words, said, "I don't have any independence, okay? I can't do what the other ladies are doing. But if you have independence, because you're a godless whore, you can turn that right around and go work for the war effort," right? So we had that messaging, but then also rationing and conserving food, making sure you were feeding your husband well, so that he could go off to war and serve in war. All of those things were advertised. And really, ultimately, what I find so interesting about this is in the advertising and the messaging of America, we have been encouraged, despite, when I talked about Pledge of Allegiance was written by a copywriter to sell newspapers, to sell the Youth's Companion newspaper in 1892. And if you as a reader sold more newspapers, you would get a free flag. The man who wrote this, Francis Bellamy, he was a socialist. And he actually believed that the problem problem with advertising and the American message in the 1800s was that it was too focused on individualism. So he really wanted to make sure that the country was united under this concept of don't be selfish, don't be individualistic. You have to subvert your own desires, your own goals for the good of the nation. And the way this was often framed was specifically in a buying context. It was like, don't be selfish and save your money, be selfless and buy into the economy. And not only that, when you weave in buy American ads and campaigns that have gone up and down throughout history, anytime there's a challenge in this country, there's a war, you will see an uptick of buy American advertising. But in studies of this advertising, it's very hard to pinpoint whether or not these campaigns truly increased spending on national products. But what it did increase was a sense that you could express your citizenship, you could express your patriotism by buying American goods. And it was more about buying into the concept of, I will pay more for this Ford car than I will a Honda, theoretically. I'm just making this up. I don't know how these things are priced. I don't understand cars, but that you should subvert your individual benefits of saving money for the greater good of feeding the economy. And that ultimately is the message of the United States of America right now. Is you might not have the freedoms that you want, but you need to take one for the team. You need to be a good team player, right? And this idea that we keep paying into the American dream, but the product of freedom is kind of on the shelf on layaway. This was designed by a socialist, right? He wanted to make sure that we were creating more of like a nationalist sentiment within the nation, which is subvert and sacrifice your individual happiness, right, for the good of the nation. And that especially ramped up during World War II with World War II advertising. I'll pull up a few more examples of this. Show your patriotism by buying Chesterfield cigarettes. The soldiers love them. Everybody loves them. Just, smoke your way to a better country. Keep your beauty on duty. You know what, ladies, even if you're on the front, that is not any excuse for not looking like $1 million. What I think is interesting to note and important to note about this entire time period of advertising was that if you notice from all of the ads that I've shared, what these ads were also doing was creating a single homogenous image of what a good American should be. Because around the turn of the 20th century, the country was and is multilingual and multicultural. And a lot of people identified themselves by their hyphens, if you would. Like, I am a Polish American. I am a African American. I am an Italian American. A lot of the communities all had their own identities and their own traditions. And there wasn't actually a sense of unity, partially because, as I said, the country was very rural. People lived far away from each other. One of the goals of advertising was to unite the country into a single homogenous culture, image, language. There was a government letter that went out to store owners in 1905 saying the way that you keep your stores clean and tidy is a civilizing influence on people like the indigenous or the immigrants, who they were implying were rough or messy or dirty. And so you want to keep your store in a certain way to encourage people to be clean and tidy because that is the American way. Let's not forget, though, that at the time in this rural America that I'm speaking of, everyone was dirty and smelly. Like, people didn't bathe regularly. This wasn't isolated to these particular groups, right? This was the whole country pretty much, other than the extremely wealthy. You didn't use deodorant. You didn't brush your teeth as much. It wasn't a thing. We were a smelly, sweaty, dirty country. And so one of the roles and the goals of advertising was to homogenize us, was to assimilate the immigrant populations, was to promote an image of the ideal American. And the ideal American started off just being like a skinny white dude, like a rich white married dude. And then it was women as well, right? In the early 20th century, advertisers realized we can't keep trying to advertise to everyone because women are making the majority of the household purchases. So then they started addressing women directly in their ads. And in some ways, historians look back on this and they say, oh, this was a step forward for women because what it did was it acknowledged that women had buying power. It acknowledged that women were participants in the economy. But at the same time, having liberation be framed within the terms of now you can buy more shit that you don't really need. It's a mixed bag here. It's a complicated tale. As much as this might have been a step forward for women, it was a step forward for white women because that's who was being advertised to. And in the few ads that existed that had anything other than a white man or a white woman or a white child in it, there was stereotypes and caricatures of other communities, caricatures of the indigenous, caricatures of the Black community, reinforcing stereotypes, reinforcing racism, and that wasn't an accident. Advertising's role going up until the 50s was really to promote this one homogenous single image of what it is to be a good American. And a good American buys all the time. And a good American subverts their individual interests for the greater good. When it comes to the war effort, a good American looks and acts in a certain way, and they frame their sense of citizenship and patriotism in economic terms. As we got into the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, with the 60s and 70s, we have these fights for civil liberties. You have these social justice movements, movements for desegregation. We have movements towards equal rights. We have, movements for women, movements for the Black population, movements for the disabled population. All of these different movements are coming up. And the people are fighting back and they're saying, we no longer are responding to these ads showing a homogenous view of what it is to be an American because we don't all look like that. And we don't all want to be like that. So what happened? The brands responded. And historically, if you look back at any cultural changes, you will see kind of going back to the 60s and 70s, oftentimes when there is any kind of cultural movement happening, people are fighting for their liberation in some terms. It is almost always brands that are first to the party. And brands who through their ads want to create a veneer, an advertised utopian world, almost as if to tell us, if you buy this product, you are buying these rights, these freedoms, this sense of identity that you want so badly. Buy the United Colors of Benetton, which actually is an Italian company. It's not an American company. But if you buy the United Colors of Benetton, you are expressing your desire to live in a world where we all are united in this beautiful utopian way. If you buy from the Gap Red Fight AIDS campaign that happened in the early 2000s, you are buying your place in the movement to end the AIDS epidemic, et cetera, right? And so what started to happen in the 60s and 70s and then accelerated into the 80s and 90s as the brands in response. Number one, it was in response to counterculture. But number two, it was in response to the fact that the development of media allowed for more niche advertising, right? So with cable television and different niche radio stations came the ability to tailor your ads to different audiences. You could tailor an ad to an audience on MTV. You could tailor an ad to an audience on Nickelodeon, on Lifetime. And so, yes, then we had the ability to create more tailored ads, which allowed brands to grab different market shares based on the niche communities that they were advertising to. But they were doing it in this very condescending, patronizing way that was like patting people on the head and being like, we see you, buy our shit. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. Burger King getting into the diversity game. America loves burgers. So a lot of burger companies, cola companies, soft drink companies really started picking up the pace in the 70s and the 80s, saying, we are the brand for your community. In these ads that, to me, as I look at them now, it's patronizing. Finally, we're going to acknowledge that different people live in the United States other than the upper middle class white man or woman Protestant family. Let's talk about jumping onto a cultural movement so that your brand will be associated with the ideals of a movement. Old, cold Newport. And what I think is really important about this ad is it is no mistake that the man in this ad has a fist raised. What Newport cigarettes are trying to do is saying we are aligning with the ideals and with the fight for liberation that this community represents, and that you can see even in what they're wearing, even in their hair, even in the body language. So this is where you can start to see a shift. No longer is the rosy face of America being painted in this kind of one-dimensional way of like a white woman holding a tray of food saying like food is ammunition, go to war by canning your own vegetables. So now there's more dimension to the ads. It is creating the illusion that, number one, that by participating in the marketplace, you can achieve these greater social and cultural breakthroughs, that you can achieve liberation through buying a cigarette. And in general, that has been very much the American dream and the American message, which is through the free market, you can achieve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That as much as that might have been in the Constitution, the subtext is pull yourself up by your bootstraps and create that for yourself by participating in the economy, by becoming an entrepreneur, by using your individualism to achieve these aims. This is 1971, Coke's very famous campaign that then made its way into Mad Men. I'd like to buy the world of Coke. There wasn't an overtly patriotic message here because it was meant to be a global message, but this is an example of Coke piggybacking onto hippie culture and counterculture and expressing the message to its buyers that if you want to embody world peace and unity, you can do that by buying our product. The countercultural messages of the time were very much encouraging people to opt out of buying culture. They were saying tune out, drop out of consumer culture, stop buying, and go back into nature. Go fight for justice, fight and protest the war, right? When we got into the Vietnam era. And the brands were freaking out. They were like, how do we keep people buying? The whole culture and message of the day is to turn off the television, to shut the newspaper and the magazine, and to go out and be with each other and to be in nature. There were a lot of spiritual new age movements coming up at the time that encouraged people to find the answers within. So what did the brands do? Just like I said, they hitched their wagons to the cultural movements of the time, and they created this kind of utopian veneer of suggesting that you could buy your way to that identity of what you bought, what you wore, your identity as expressed through consumption. In the early 20th century, it was about teaching people and training people to buy as an expression of their American freedom. You have the freedom to choose between all of these different products, no matter who you are, no matter your class, your race, your gender, your sex, whatever it might be. You can buy whatever you want if only you have the money in your pocket. And so Americans in the early 20th century were trained to buy, period. We were trained to buy all the time. We were trained to do the shopping. That's when doing the shopping kind of became a verb. Before this time, you didn't do the shopping. You bought very infrequently, and you typically didn't have enough disposable income to do it. Few people understand that even before there were labor regulations or wages were federally forced to be increased, a lot of companies voluntarily reduced the workday, reduced the work week, and increased wages. Why? Because they cared about human rights? Because they were good emblems of the American way? No, but because they knew that if the buying public, the public en masse, didn't have enough disposable income to continue buying back into the economy, they weren't going to be able to offload all of these goods that they were making in their factories. And if they didn't have enough time, because people were tired and they didn't have a lot of disposable income, they were exhausted, they were being worked to the bone. If people didn't have enough time to relax, I've rested, I've restored, and now it's time to go shopping. Even before it was federally mandated, lots of companies lowered the workday hours, lowered the work week hours, gave people more time to rest, increased their wages just enough so they could go out and spend their free time buying stuff. And then you can see by the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, now it's not simply that we're in the habit of buying, buying then throughout, the World War I and World War II, buying or not buying, depending on what was going on, was a way that you expressed your patriotism specifically. And that was pretty much the only thing that you were being sold. You bought to show that you were an American. But then people aren't satisfied with this. People are fighting for more rights. They're fighting for representation. They're fighting for visibility. They're fighting for justice. So now the brands pivot into, you can buy these individual elements of your identity. You buy this product to show that you're a rebel. You buy this product to show that you believe in liberation and justice. You buy this product because you want a one world. I'd like to buy the world of Coke. I'm going to buy Coca-Cola because I want to believe I'm the type of person that believes in diversity and in equality and in a unified global utopia, right? And now we can see that that has now become even more so today. We see this with rainbow washing. We see this with companies that hop on various cultural movements. And what this does, and I think is important here, what this does is it creates like an illusion of progress that doesn't really exist. And the brands are the first to do that. I mean, you saw this a few years ago when Trump originally brought down all those travel bans and was doing all these awful things at the border, all of the companies for Super Bowl came out with these dramatic, emotional, sentimental ads like, we believe in America with no walls and we're the embodiment of true freedom. And what the brands were doing is that they were paying lip service to something that they actually weren't backing up, whether it comes to their labor practices and sweatshop labor and how they're sourcing their goods and how they're paying their workers, or the politicians that they're spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars supporting, that actually did reinforce and make sure that some of these jingoistic, nationalistic policies were in place. But the brands want us to feel like they're on our side, right? And so what this does is it creates this false sense of security for consumers. We feel like, because the advertising world, if you were just to watch the television and watch the ads, especially in the 80s and 90s and especially today, if you were like an alien that came from outer space to like observe our planet and you only interpreted the country or the world through its advertising, you would believe that we were a beautiful, multicultural, multiracial, liberated community, global citizenry, right? If we flash forward to today, now we get into the era of you can't spell sausage without USA. So if the advertisers of like the mid-century were all about advertising patriotism in and of itself, but doing it at least feel like in a more layered way, because at least there was something you could do about it. Back then it was like, I'm going to ration food to show my love for this country. Now it's just like, buy a giant wiener and you're an American, right? And if you kind of flash forward to today's advertising in the way that either America itself is advertised or the concept of America is used to advertise, there's kind of two schools of advertising. One is a school like this. It's kind of like the unthinking advertise. It's the easy, I'm just going to co-opt the flag and these concepts of freedom or whatever, and I'm just going to plug them into an ad. It's 4th of July, buy some beer, be free. And there isn't really any nuance to it. And I'll show you another one. Like I just watched Independence Day again, so this one got me. Go forth, America. That's Bill Pullman holding up a Budweiser beer. And if you haven't seen the movie Independence Day, he was the president in that movie, and he does this like, do not go gently into this good night speech. Like, today, Independence Day will no longer be an American holiday. This will be a day that the whole world remembers we were free from aliens. So I mean, I think it's a hilarious and smart move for Budweiser to use Bill Pullman in this ad. But this would be an example of one school of advertising around either advertising America and American ideals or using America to advertise your product and not even really trying very hard to make a big connection. Kind of a superficial, take the logo, take the phrases and inject them into our advertising. Because, fun fact, 4th of July is the beer industry's biggest holiday. This is where they make their money. Somebody I was talking to this weekend was like, are you sure it's not Christmas? And I'm like, no, I can't definitively say this, but I would bet that Christmas and the holiday and the end of year and New Year's is a much bigger bang for like the wine industry, like the liquor industry. But beer specifically makes its money on July 4th. Beer and apparently wieners, RKA Johnsonville hot dog brats. Okay, so you got these types of ads. But then you have, as I said, when we talk about how this has become more nuanced, PBR, Pabst Blue Ribbon, would fall into the second camp in terms of you just got some brands that slap a flag on something and they're like, we're American, buy our beer, deal with it. So they're the kind of like the one-dimensional, superficial, patriotic ads. But then you have these companies hitching their wagons to the conversation of the times, to the cultural moment that we're in. So PBR came out with it's an American Dreaming campaign, and they co-produced 2 6-minute documentaries with Vice News. Features the first-person narratives of a group of Americans, including the daughter of an undocumented immigrant, a drag queen, a Latinx individual, and others, all meant to express that the most diverse generation in American history is redefining the American dream. Remember that America in its inception was a multicultural, multilingual nation, and advertising told all of these various communities, you need to assimilate and become one type of America. You need to try to be as close as possible to this white emblem of civility and gentility that embodies and encapsulates the ideal American. But now in 2022, PBR is trying to say, no. Now we're diverse. Now please express your patriotism and buy from us as a way of embodying the American dream. Kind of contradictory, right? And so the videos emphasize the themes of freedom and opportunity while using patriotic imagery like uniformed service members, Western landscapes, and a nightclub rendering of the Star-Spangled Banner. And so this would be an example of it's a contrast with Budweiser, which they're just like, remember, he helped us defeat the aliens in Independence Day. He's got a beer, America. And PBR is trying to say, listen, the real American dream is this nuanced, layered, you define it. You define it in your individual identity. We celebrate. And on its face, this is wonderful, right? We want to see different people represented. We want to see a diversity of viewpoints and representation in the media in general. But what I find troubling about it is the brands essentially are hitching their wagons to the cultural movements to create a superficial, a false sense of security, a veneer of progress that not only do their policies, their workplace policies, as well as their political contributions actually contradict, when all of media creates a rosy picture, or when, let's even take it further, when we talk about things like greenwashing or rainbow washing, when political and social movements are used for a brand to make more money, I'm not about that. Fuck that. So patriotic campaigns throughout history have built the American brand while building their own brands to get our buy-in to this nationalist sentiment. And we see our political efficacy as citizens and individuals through the lens of consumption. That's what the problem is with a PBR ad or with a rainbow washing ad, is it tells us, the message is, you can buy your way to activism. The revolution can be bought. The revolution can be purchased. And that we can consume our identity, that we buy things as a reflection of our identity. We're doing this for our country. We're doing this for the greater good. Remember how saving money was positioned as selfish? So if we go back into what is a brand and what is a logo meant to do, it's meant to ultimately be repeated enough times that it calls up a memory, it calls up an association, that once we see the American flag and we immediately think freedom, justice, Star-Spangled Banner, it's meant to kind of override our reason and our logic and override our critical thinking and create a warm fuzzy. That is what branding is meant to do at the end of the day. And I think that that's what has happened with the American brand, is that even its critics couch their criticism within the context of always having to say, I love this country and that's why I critique it. Because we've been told that loving the country, that being patriotic makes you a good person. You want to be a good person? Buy this product. If you want to be a good person, ration your food. If you want to be a good person, contribute to the Gap Red campaign and fight AIDS. If you want to be a good person, you want to be a good American, buy a Budweiser. It's shutting down our critical thinking, where take a step back from the American brand and say, if America is a brand, which I believe it is, what is the value proposition? Is America delivering on its brand promise? Or is it more like a product that's been put on layaway that we keep paying into and that we haven't actually had it delivered? I said before that the Constitution, in my opinion, was little more than advertising copywriting. The brand promise of this nation, the product that was being sold to us, freedom and justice for all, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founding fathers, even when they wrote that, had no intention of actually giving that brand promise to every single American. They knew they couldn't deliver that to us. It might have been the ideal. That's wonderful. That's great. But when the country was founded, that brand promise wasn't available to all Americans. So they were selling us a product that they hadn't created yet, just like Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. And so I ask, and this is the question I ask to you, with what other brand can make promises for hundreds of years and not deliver on those promises? In fact, what other brand can say, here's the promise and here's what you're going to get with this product. Please buy in. Give us your taxes, give us your votes, give us your brand loyalty. And actually, though, if you want the product, you're going to have to make it yourself. Because that's the freaking message of the brand of America. We want your buy-in, we want your dollars, we want your votes. And actually, though, if you really want like the brand promise of freedom and justice for all, why don't you fight for it? Why don't you figure it out? What other brand can do that and consistently have people buying in over and over again and being unabashedly brand loyal? I don't know. I think it's time to truly investigate whether America has ever delivered on its promise, whether it even can in the current conditions, and whether continuing to buy in is the best way for us to achieve it. Because who doesn't want freedom and justice for all, right? It's it's great copywriting. We all want it. Just like, who doesn't want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Can it be achieved in our current conditions? Can it be achieved in our current system? If propaganda was meant to subvert our reason and logic, and Justice Brandeis argued after World War I that people can only be happy if they're able to think for themselves and pursue free discourse and free thinking, then I'm thinking about these questions. We're told that to love our country is to sacrifice our own individual desires for the greater good. But my question is, who's part of this greater good? Because it seems to me at this point that the amount of people suffering within the United States of America outweigh the people thriving. So going back to this concept that America is a brand, my question is, it's time to start asking ourselves, what is the value proposition here? Is America delivering on its brand promise? Can it under the current conditions? Is America little more than a layaway plan where you keep paying in and paying in and paying in, and the product of freedom and justice for all sits on the shelf? There's supply chain issues. Sorry, we can't deliver that freedom just yet, but can we have your taxes? Think for yourselves. See you on the internet.
If you want more marketing muckraking and brand strategy gone wild, I invite you to subscribe to this show. And if you enjoyed it, leave me a review. That really helps me out. If you hated it, please send it to your enemies. They sound like good people. You can go to rachelkalbers.com/subscribe to get these updates in your inbox. And because this show is self-sponsored, if you wanted to support my work, you can go to buymearobe.com. That's where the magic happens. In the meantime, remember, it's not the age of the niche, it's the age of the wildcard bitch. See you on the internet.